Throughout the ages, ships of trade have carried the world's riches and commodities of everyday life. Today, ancient underwater wrecks are yielding fresh insights of life across many continents and centuries. 2,000 years ago, a ship from the Roman age was lost off the coast of Britain. The ship has now been found, but it is now a race against time to uncover her secrets of life long ago. Off Bermuda, a recent expedition has uncovered the Sea Venture. The ordeal of this trading vessel, lost in 1610, inspired Shakespeare to write The Tempest. Now the Sea Venture is revealing its own dramatic story. The excavation of another trading ship, the Amsterdam, promises to be one of the most complete 18th century vessels ever found. Join the adventure, next, on Discoveries Underwater.
Discoveries Underwater is made possible in part by a grant from the DuPont Company. DuPont, better things for better living. And by this and other public television stations.
Throughout history, the world's trade has been borne by the sea. Sailing ships have linked peoples and cultures for thousands of years. These ships bore not only cargoes of riches, but also the basic commodities of life. They are a historical record of the ages, a mirror of everyday life in their time, a time when life at sea was full of danger.
The rugged coast of Devon has lured many a gallant ship to her doom. There's beauty and grandeur in these gnarled cliffs, but treachery too. Fast on the rocks in Hope Cove near Salcombe lies the Herzogin Cecily, largest and most famous of the few sailing vessels of today. 8 times the Finnish bark has won the grain race from Australia, but now her days are numbered. Aground from stem to stern she lies at the mercy of the sea. Look down on the beautiful ship, her mainmast 200 feet high, her 56,000 square feet of canvas furled for the last time, and grieve with her captain and her crew.
Trading ships driven by the wind have now completely disappeared, but their cargoes remain. This cargo, from a wrecked Dutch East Indiaman of 1748, arrived in Europe 200 years late. When the cargo was sold, it brought prices that would have been unheard of in the 18th century. Then it was just another consignment of Chinese tableware for the European market and sold by the crate. The great trading nations of the world, like England and Holland, carried their flags across the sea to all parts of the globe. In the 18th century, the most famous company of all was the Dutch East India Company. This enterprise traded from Europe to as far away as China. Everyday objects like porcelain were mass-produced in the hills and shipped down to warehouses of Canton. Tea, silks, spices, exotica from the Far East, in return for silver from the West. Trading ships are basically ambassadors of nations. Their armaments were in past times more defensive than aggressive. They were bulk carriers and slow-moving, but they carried their cargoes cheaply and efficiently. They were also decorative and beautiful, reflecting the elegance and style of their age. In 1749, One of the Dutch East India's vessels, the Amsterdam, ran aground on Hastings Beach off Great Britain. It was rediscovered in 1967 by local workmen laying a sewage pipe. The foreman was well aware of the rumor that the Amsterdam lay somewhere nearby. When the tide was out, he began to dig. Within minutes, the teeth of the bulldozer dug into the wood of the ship's hull. The attention that the discovery attracted was typical of the attitudes to shipwrecks 20 years ago. People were more interested in the ship's objects than in the wreck itself. The greatest prize were the cannons. They were not to be seen together for long. They bore the marks of the Dutch East India Company, their original rightful owners. There was enough furor about this discovery to attract traditional archaeologists. The Amsterdam surfaces ghost-like on the low spring tides every 3 months. For a few precious hours, the outline is visible, the ship accessible. The archaeologists begin work. Land archaeology on these half-submerged mud flats is hard work, crude and makeshift, even for the professional. The same night, the next low tide gives another opportunity for work. But the faster the sea goes out, the faster it comes back in. With some of the mud cleared, there is evidence here of a substantial trading ship. The lights reveal a whole ship's side buried some 30 feet deep under the mud. But under these conditions, controlled excavation is totally impossible. Within 4 hours, the tide reclaims the Amsterdam, one of the few intact examples of an 18th century East Indiaman to survive anywhere in the world. Since 1969, marine archaeology has developed enormously. While the Amsterdam has not moved, techniques to excavate her have changed significantly. 1984 saw the start of a new venture, an excavation working not when the tide was out, but when the tide was in. A specially constructed cofferdam encloses the far end of the wreck. It acts partly as a sea break and partly as the working platform for what now is a cooperative diving venture by 2 nations, Britain and Holland. The Dutch director of the excavation is Jerzy Gawronski.
All the first shifts will work on the starboard side. That means that all the airless has to be brought over. They're all laying on the port side now. So that's Adrian, Colin, Sarah, Dick and Ippe. According to circumstances, we will decide between the 3rd and the 4th shift to have a window. It means a non-airlift period in which all the divers are out of the water and the airlifts are out of use. So John will be able to have good visibility to do a video run of some points of the ship and the wreck. Because if this radar breaks, it will be the last chance to have decent visibility.
Weather permitting, the season can be infinite. The power, communications, high-pressure air and video control are based on shore. Only the divers need to be taken out to the site. For the next 3 months, the operation will continue from this steel tower sitting out at sea. A tower that can operate at all levels of the tide.
Right.
Unlike most archaeological operations which use standard diving gear, the Amsterdam team uses full-scale commercial industrial diving equipment. The English director is John Adams, former assistant director of the excavation of King Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose.
Okay, John, comms check. How do you hear me?
Loud and clear, Adrian. How me?
Loud and clear, also. Stand by for bailout check.
Roger.
Close bailout.
Bailout closed. Okay.
Well, when the Amsterdam became an underwater excavation, rather than a dry land or welly boot dig, it was a necessary transition in the sense that the productivity we needed, the amount of work we needed to get done, meant we had to be able to work on it all day for months at a time. In the dry land situation, you were having to get down to the wreck for a few hours a day, for 2 or 3 days at a time, four times a year. And in those situations, you were actually having to dig a large hole very, very quickly. And it's very difficult to actually see what's going on. Now, underwater, surprisingly, the more water you have over the site, the easier it is to work on the actual ship.
The Amsterdam lies under 20 feet of water. The visibility is murky for the divers, but the ship's timbers are accessible and easy to work around.
John? How are you doing and whereabouts are you?
I've just done a shot with the beam, so I'm going to let the visibility clear. Get out the hole for a bit. I'm just going to go and check Jersey's area and make sure he's aware of my presence.
An underwater video system improves the ability to monitor the work. It also proves helpful in revealing the structure of the ship.
We have fairly major constructional differences showing up between what has been learnt from a very detailed model and the actual reality in which the structural elements of the ship have been put together. These are working drawings from a model that was almost rediscovered, if you like, in Amsterdam last year, which, if not of the actual ship, is certainly of that particular class of ships. I'm dealing in particular with an elevation of the inboard structure on the port side, concentrating on the lower gun deck and the upper gun deck. And here we have a very good example of the sort of differences that the reality gives you from the best possible guess, if you like, from the contemporary archives. You might be forgiven for thinking that, looking at drawings like this, that there was no necessity to survey the remains of the actual ship, because there wouldn't be much more information you could learn. These drawings look so final and so perfect that we would know everything about the ship. However, the survey that we're conducting at the moment, on the inboard structure in particular, shows very dramatic differences in the disposition of the main structural elements. And it shows that even in the middle of the 18th century, that when it got beyond the drawing board, the specifications laid down by the East India Company designers, to the shipyard, the shipwright could at the last moment obviously decide that he didn't want to put a knee up under the deck beams. He'd rather have it against a transom lower down, because he felt obviously that it would do a better job there. Similarly, we're finding things, especially on the outside of the ship, which are so like the model it's uncanny. So you get both extremes. You get confirmation of the design details being followed, but major structural differences at the same time. Contrary to popular belief, in many shipwrecks, even those that have been badly smashed up, the material that is found by the archaeologists within the hull is not just a random scatter. And by surveying in exactly where the material is, you can actually work back and establish where it was originally in the ship, how it was designed, how it was put together, and in some cases who owned it.
The most advanced method of survey yet devised is used on this site. Direct survey measurement can cope with all combinations of tide, visibility, and the skill of any diver. It is a way of fixing every object in time and space at the moment of discovery.
if there's any problem with the datum points, it'll either tell you that it either doesn't recognise the name of the datum point or that it hasn't got the coordinates for the datum, in which case you have to supply them later. But that's okay. It knows where all those datum points are in 3 dimensions, so now it's ready for you to give it some of the objects you surveyed.
The computer is another set of eyes. Eyes connected to a permanent memory bank and the ability to recall information at any time.
1.635. Okay, bottle 21. End of file, right, that's it, done. So you've got all your coordinates? Yeah. So in fact we might as well print that.
Trading ships usually carry the very ordinary things of life, as well as the exotic. Bits and pieces that often go unnoticed. Bottles. Sections of rope. Even handfuls of pins. The bottles are often corked full of wine. 3 objects: bottle, cork, and contents, found together. Each of them can yield vital pieces of information. All of them are just as they were on Sunday, January the 26th, 1749, the date they were lost. Lifting objects from sea to air can be difficult. This coil of rope, for example, must be lifted so that the separate fibers don't disintegrate as it is raised out of the water.
The rope is already broken there.
All right.
The planning of the Amsterdam operation is comprehensive. Members of the conservation team are ready and waiting on shore to assist. A local ballroom in a vacation camp is now a conservation area, the domain of archaeologist Peter Marsden.
Oh, it's nice with all the marbles, gaming marbles here. I think they are. It's part of a set, gaming set.
Conservationists have to be able to cope with every possible substance. Like this, for instance, a drinking glass, wrapped in its original packing. Both packing and glass are undamaged. Until fully conserved, these objects are incredibly fragile. They have to be sprayed constantly with water while being photographed to prevent them from drying out, flaking, or disintegrating. Immediate photography is an integral part of the recording process.
We'll treat the bottle as object number 1 of the group. Then the cork as object number 2.
Yes.
And the contents as object number 3.
Ownership.
Ownership, BOC.
A special feature of the Amsterdam's excavation is having access to the surviving historical land records of the ship's cargo. They indicate what this material cost at the time, where it was going, and in the case of personal objects, to whom they belonged.
One of the most important aspects of the Amsterdam is that it is an extraordinary combination of archaeological record and historical record. And these two things together give us a picture of life in the past, which you cannot normally get from the historical records alone or from archaeological remains alone. And in one way, this comes together particularly well with this object, which to me is I think, the most exciting thing that we've found. It's the lid of a box with the initials WK carved on it. And there was only one person on board with those initials, and this is clearly the lid of one of the chests belonging to Willem Klump, the captain of the ship. And in the paybook of the ship, which these are copies, we find down here, Willem Klump of Mitau, Captain Lieutenant, 5 kelders, 5 wine boxes, and no chests. So no chests of personal possessions, but there are 5 wine boxes. And this is the lid. It's too small to be a personal chest anyway. And this is clearly one of these objects which are documented. Well, this had fallen from the captain's cabin outside the ship and had been caught round by the stern post under the curving counter of the ship. So here we have the two things coming together. Many of the other objects in the ship can be related to a limited number of people, and so in this way we're able to build up a picture of the community in a way which one cannot get from documentary records alone or purely from the archaeological artifacts alone.
This piece of a lady's quilted dress still had the pins in position. At the time of the tragedy, the owner, Petronella Shook, was working on it. Her handiwork survived. Even delicate things, like this flower from a hat band, had been preserved in the mud as if it were only yesterday.
I mean, with most excavations, you actually haven't got that much material left. With Amsterdam, we have 2/3 of a ship full of cargo, personal belongings. And you also, in the VOC, have one of the best documented maritime enterprises ever. Now, you put the two together, and you have an unparalleled opportunity to get a very, very detailed insight into that period in Dutch history.
But some details are unexpected, like the artistry on the stern of the ship discovered in the last days of the excavation. The intricate carving of a mermaid's tail. The Amsterdam was decorated and ornamented to the highest standards of the Dutch East India Company. The rest of the ship is still in place, in a remarkable state of preservation, still waiting to be uncovered. It will take many years of excavation before the picture can be completed. It will take money, time, and cooperation. And the project will always be at the mercy of the tides and the weather. Here in Red Bay, Labrador, remains of a different kind are helping archaeologists piece together a picture of life and death of a people far away from home. At this site, underwater archaeology is working hand in hand with land archaeology to discover more about the first traders to exploit Canada's natural resources. Men who crossed the Atlantic 400 years ago from Europe. The search begins in the Basque country of northern Spain, where there stands an ancient monastery. Inside are legal and commercial documents, wills and bills of sale, records of a people from a bygone age. By delving through hundreds of manuscripts, historians have formed a picture of life in the small villages along the coast of northern Spain in the 16th century. They were searching for the records of one particular village, San Juan, and the sailors of that village who traveled across the Atlantic in a trading ship which never returned. In the summer months, cod fishermen traveled as far as Newfoundland but never stayed long. Those who were tempted to remain until December were sometimes trapped by the weather and forced to pursue whales. The Basques were the first to hunt whales, pursuing them off their coast as early as the 11th century. In fact, they invented whale hunting. In 1665, a whaling ship, the San Juan, was caught in a storm in Red Bay, Labrador. The same fate befell the Bernier, a modern ironclad ship. It was this ship that provided the clue to the location of the San Juan. In 1978, a Canadian Parks archaeological dive team led by Robert Grenier found the remains of the San Juan. The hull had been flattened to the seabed. The mud and ice provided for a remarkable state of preservation. But the cold that had preserved the wreck so well was a problem for the archaeologists spending long periods underwater working on the wreck. The expedition was able to command all the elements of a full-scale commercial diving operation. This diving barge is capable of supplying hot water to the archaeologists working underwater. These hot water suits were essential to keep the divers warm for 2 hours at a time, twice a day, 5 days a week. They found the ordinary objects of everyday life. An hourglass, discarded possessions of the crew, forgotten as the crew scrambled ashore. Everything was covered with a sticky substance, whale oil, evidence that this was a whaling ship. The timbers lying on the seabed showed that a substantial amount of the hull remained. After every piece of wood was recorded, Robert Grenier made a scale model of the ship.
Feeling about the location of this beam, which has the mizzenmast mortise.
I think it comes in the stern area of the vessel here. It's pretty short. Someplace up around here, I think.
Yes. I think if you back it up a little bit, that looks pretty good.
Right
That looks correct, yes.
Okay. Put a clamp on it.
The angle is right.
Away from the ship, closer to the shore, further evidence of the whaling trade. Digging a trench as a reference line between the wreck and the shore, the divers found a multitude of whale bones. These bones, evidence of the work carried out along the shore by the whale hunters, are the past's industrial waste. Today, they provide clues to the techniques the bass once used to butcher their prey. The Labrador climate changes quite abruptly, and more than once the bass found themselves trapped by the ice, unable to return home. The land archaeologists from Newfoundland's Memorial University found evidence of makeshift shelters where the whalers would sit out the winter. They also found 1,000 graves. Whaling was a risky business. This land site, the whale bones, and the wreck itself all combined together to give a clearer picture of life for the bass in this once remote and desolate place in the 16th century. Their skills in whaling and seamanship were soon adopted by others, and their monopoly of the whaling industry was broken. By the mid-17th century, the Red Bay settlements were abandoned as the bass turned towards more lucrative trades in the West Indies and Seville.
now the shipping forecast issued by the Meteorological Office at 2343 on Tuesday, the 13th of November, 1984. There are warning scales in Viking, Norfolk, 0...
Back in the Old World, off the Channel Islands of Britain, archaeologists are excavating a ship almost 2,000 years old. This is St. Peter Port, Guernsey. Working in the harbor entrance is the tiny diving vessel of the Guernsey Maritime Trust. Underneath this ship lies a Celtic ship.
Again, just passing St. Martin's. Clearance to enter, please.
This diving vessel, all clear, and all clear for you to enter.
Roger, all received. Very many thanks.
Margaret Rule, who excavated King Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, is project director here.
She lies in the entrance to the harbour, and she's very much subjected to the prop wash from every large vessel that goes in and out. It's that prop wash which exposed her in the first place.
Hard to starboard.
Slim's going south.
Yeah, we know all about that now. See the mud coming up yesterday?
I'm convinced that the tops of the timbers were the seabed level prior to 1982. And now she's been systematically washed apart. There's no real strength in the fastenings of the hull, and she's being torn to pieces. In some cases, the timbers are simply lifting off and moving, but in other instances, the timbers have been torn in half, just like a torn stick of rhubarb. And I dived on the site 2.5 months ago, and it was very, very clear that we had no time at all. Something had to be done to remove those loose timbers and survey the structure before it broke up.
This site had to be worked as a rescue operation. There were few resources to recover what seemed to be a few unpromising-looking timbers. Such a ship in such a place was unheard of. The Romans, trading between Celtic Gaul and Britain, were not known to frequent Guernsey. Was this ship lying buried under a cargo of molten tar and pitch Roman or Celtic? Only archaeology could determine. Breaking up the solidified pitch underwater is not an easy job. It has to be done with care and consideration in order to preserve any object that might be trapped within.
Right, I think we'll get the divers up. Time's come. Now boat.
Can you bring them over?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
In addition to the usual dangers of diving in near freezing water, the divers are constantly hindered by the continual passage of mail boats and ferries.
Doesn't look too bad.
It's over time now. It's 9:15. We must be out the way.
It's all clear. Thank you.
Under this grid is the outline of what has been determined to be a Celtic vessel. Heavily built, very closely framed, and for the archaeologists, difficult to interpret until it is carefully measured and drawn. John Adams, fresh from work on the Amsterdam, is involved in the mapping and recording. By November, there's more darkness than daylight.
Diver in, Dave.
Straight to the other end.
Adrian.
Adrian will have cleaned that up.
Absolutely, yes.
I'll carry on
They're the
with
two, because they seem to be different. And if they're different, we've got to think about why. Yes.
Okay.
Fine. Oh, good luck. Cheers. Okay. Diver down, John Adams.
For 14 days and nights, the team continued with one of the most difficult underwater archaeological rescue operations ever done in the British Isles. But professional divers can work even in the dark. Because this site was close to the shore, lights could be supplied from the harbor pilot house. The light enabled the discovery of a small but important find. This Roman coin of 125 AD, a likely date for the loss of the ship. Lifting the heavy timbers, however, is a problem. But it's a problem solved by removing the body of a commercial truck and winching it into the sea. The 2,000-year-old timbers from the seabed will be loaded onto the truck bed.
Can you get gear on?
This ship was sturdily built. The planks are of oak 2 feet thick. Considerable effort is required to move them around. The men who built this ship built it to last. Even in the 2nd century AD, they were in the heavy transport business. In 2 very short seasons, in 1985 and 86, 95% of what could be recovered of the timbers of this very rare ship came to shore. The archaeologists have now embarked on a lengthy process of conservation and recording. Much has been learned already. One of the important and unexpected finds, though far from spectacular, is this small piece of rope trapped in the pitch. It's called a kringle. It's also the proof that this was in fact a Celtic trading ship that caught fire and sank in Guernsey Harbor. These discoveries confirm, for the first time, the accuracy of the account of just such a vessel, seen and described by Julius Caesar.
Ships made entirely from oak for strength and resistance to damage. Cross timbers fixed to 1-foot-deep whales by iron nails as thick as a man's thumb. Anchors secured by iron chains instead of ropes. Skins and thinly prepared leather instead of sailcloth, either due to weakness of their linen and ignorance of its use for the purpose, or, as is more probable, because they thought that the great storms and high winds of the Atlantic could not satisfactorily be withstood, nor ships of such great weight be driven by sails of cloth.
Like Caesar, William Shakespeare was also familiar with storms and wrote about them in The Tempest.
I boarded the king's ship, now on the beak, now in the waist, the deck. In every cabin I flamed amazement. The fire and cracks of sulphurous roaring, the most mighty Neptune seemed to besiege and make his bold waves tremble, yea, his dread trident shake.
Shakespeare's description was based on an account by Sir George Somers of the Sea Venture, a 17th century ship sailing from England to America. The year was 1609. Captain Somers found himself cast away on a terrifying island.
We found it to be the dangerous and dreaded islands, which were so terrible to all that ever touched on them, and such tempests, thunders, and other fearful objects we seen and heard about them, that they be called commonly the Devil's Islands.
But the survivors' fears soon turned out to be groundless.
Yet it pleased our merciful God to make even this hideous and hated place both the place of our safety and means of our deliverance. Yet did we find the air temperate and the country abundantly fruitful of all necessaries for the sustentation and preservation of man's life. There is fowl in great number upon the islands where they breed, the bird being of the bigness of a good pigeon, and layeth eggs as big as hen's eggs upon the sand. And there is a tree called a palmetto tree, which hath a very sweet berry upon which the hogs do most feed. But our men, finding the sweetness of them, did willingly share with the hogs for them, they being very pleasant and wholesome. Wherefore my opinion sincerely of this island is that, whereas it hath been and is still accounted the most dangerous, infortunate, and most forlorn place of the world, it is in truth the richest, healthfullest, and pleasing land, and merely natural, as ever man set foot upon.
The Island of Devils, beautifully described by an ordinary Elizabethan trading sea captain, was in fact one of the islands of Bermuda. Even today, it is difficult to navigate into the harbor of St. George's. Traveling as passengers on the 17th century Sea Venture were Sir Thomas Gates, the governor of the new colony of Virginia in America, and his deputy. They weren't satisfied with the paradise they'd found and looked for deliverance from it. Out of the wreckage of the old Sea Venture, they created a new ship they named Deliverance. From the scattered timbers, they built a much smaller vessel, commemorated here by replica. Bermuda became a colony because ships of trade often bore colonists, true merchant adventurers. But the passengers on the Deliverance were keen to reach another colony, just founded at Jamestown, Virginia. It is a tribute to the captain's ability to navigate that despite being blown hundreds of miles off course, they arrived within weeks in the James River. But not all of the new arrivals liked what they saw. Many of them preferred to return to the Island of Devils, to Bermuda. Deliverance and Sea Venture are today remembered not only in the name of the local ferry, but by some of the local inhabitants. Edmund Downing is a direct descendant of a member of the Sea Venture.
It was 1958, and I bought this boat about 2 years before, and had gotten it all fixed up with air compressor and metal detector, and had 6 glass windows in the bottom. And so it was an ideal boat for wreck hunting.
Equipped, Downing decided to seek out his ancestor's ship, the Sea Venture. He began his systematic search in May 1958.
We went out in the ocean and tried to duplicate the course of the original Sea Venture. And we went right up Sea Venture Flat, and we came to this cut in the coral, in the reef. So I said, looks exactly like the old descriptions of where the wreck was. So we started up the air compressor, and I dropped down in this cut, and I could see these ballast rocks. And I just followed this trail of ballast rocks, and I came to this enormous wreck.
No one believed Downing until recently, when a new expedition was started. The Sea Venture Trust consists of a small group working with limited resources but great determination. 2 people are the driving force behind the trust. One is a former commercial diver with over 50 years' experience diving in the most hazardous and arduous conditions imaginable. Smoky Wingood.
Put the artifact in the bag, right, with a tag, giving the DSM position.
The other is his wife, Peggy.
You got all the records in one go.
He retired when he was 54. He really would have liked something, a nice hobby, and the Maritime Museum was founded just after that. And then they started to open the file on the Sea Venture. And he thought, well, this is a wonderful way to spend my retirement. And I would like to be the man that confirms that this really is the Sea Venture. And this started 10 years of research, photography, traveling, reading, collecting.
It also meant the beginning of many other changes and sacrifices. Not many people would transform the basement of their own home into a conservation laboratory. Even fewer would recruit and support volunteers from many disciplines to work unpaid on a project with no official funding. But the care and conservation of artifacts from the sea is any excavation's first priority. The Wingoods have done just that.
The Sea Venture has never been investigated, or hadn't been up to this time, investigated archaeologically, which is the only proper way to do it. We could go out and pillage the thing and destroy the evidence forever, but it seemed the logical way to go. We've been working on it since 1978, and the finding of the Bellarmine was pure accident. I was on my way up without air, and I happened to see this bump on the bottom, which wasn't natural, and went down and just fanned the silt off the top of it, and lo and behold, there was this beautiful Bellarmine. It was quite a moment, I can tell you.
Bellamines are one of the most common forms of European jugs. Nearly every merchant ship for 200 or 300 years from the 16th century onward carried them. They are the mark of the Northern European trader, and more importantly for the Wingoods, evidence of the Sea Venture's fate. A story of ship and storm immortalized by Shakespeare. John Adams has been recruited to assist in the mapping of this wreck as project archaeologist.
Well, I think the Sea Venture has demonstrated that on a ship that is not a treasure vessel, it's a merchant ship taking people to the colonies, a very, very high standard of work can be achieved, and it can be conducted over a long period of time. The amount of post-excavation research being done on it is quite considerable. It doesn't have to be done quickly, and it doesn't have to take a lot of money at once.
The Sea Venture work has now become one of the most disciplined and well-formulated small excavations in the world. The remaining structure is covered and uncovered every season by shifting tides. It's monitored, controlled, and recorded. And because the work is done at leisure, micro water jets can be operated with infinite precision in the smallest areas. The hull that has survived both the storm and the construction of the Deliverance is historically very important. It's one of the earliest known English working ships and evidence of the actual structure of ships that fought the Armada. But what proves that it is English and the Sea Venture? Evidence comes from some of the least spectacular finds. This pottery is cheap, ordinary ware from Devon. Despite its unprepossessing appearance, this was actual proof that the wreck was the Sea Venture. Even more significantly, this pottery is a link to colonial America, the original destination of the Sea Venture. In the New World, not all of the colonies on Virginia's James River survived. Here, the lost town of Wolstenholme has recently been resurrected. The archaeology of colonial America has been a specialty of Ivor Noel Hume.
The kind of archaeology that I do, historical archaeology, or in Britain, post-medieval archaeology, wears a straitjacket of historical exactitude. By that I mean that to contribute to written history, we have to be precise. In prehistory, if we're off by 200 or 300 years, nobody's going to shoot us. But when we're dealing with our 18th and 19th centuries and 17th centuries of our own millennium, we need to be able to say, this is the way it was about our sites at a given moment, like 1622, March, Friday in the morning. And that, in fact, is when the town of Wolstenholme Town was destroyed in the Great Indian Uprising of March 22nd, 1622. Now, very rarely can you date a land site that precisely, but with shipwrecks, you can. And so if you know from a document that a ship went down at a given date, at a given location, and you go there and you find it, the result is a perfectly dated time capsule. And the things that you find on it were either in use or in transit at the moment that the water rushed in. So if you've got a shipwreck site of 1619 and you find things on it which match what we found on our site of 1622, that's confirming corroborative evidence. If, on the other hand, you find a shipwreck of 1640 and there are things on that that are found on our alleged site of 1622, then we have a problem. So you see, it's a question of underwater archaeology and land archaeology cross-fertilizing. We enrich each other. This is a West of England storage jar, which comes from our Wolstenholme Town site, and therefore we are happy that it dates prior to 1622. Similar jars to this were found aboard the Sea Venture, but when they were first found, nobody was quite sure that it was the Sea Venture, and so a whole suitcase of fragments of these things were brought to me, asked me, could this be the Sea Venture period? Well, we couldn't specifically say that, but we could say, well, yeah, these kinds of jars, this jar, which matches yours, dates prior to 1622. And that was a whole lot better than had been possible to do before, because up to that point, although these kinds of jars have been found fairly frequently in southwest England, they hadn't been found in close archaeological context, and the best one could say on them, well, they're 17th century, maybe mid-17th century, and that wasn't good enough for the Sea Venture people. So here was a case where an object that we had found really helped them. And that wasn't the only one. There was a rather extraordinary object that we'd excavated, this iron basket-like thing. It's the basket hilt from what used to be called an Irish sword. And we now know that these are very common in England. A hilt like this was found aboard the Sea Venture. And this helped military historians because they had no evidence, really, how early these things went, no physical evidence, that is, although there are some paintings. And from the Sea Venture came this hilt, which we have drawn from its very encrusted remains,
and that hilt is of the same type as this.
The archaeology of trade is about familiar objects in unfamiliar places, the commonplace and unrecorded items of everyday life. The possessions of merchants and sailors, scattered miles from their homelands, borne by ships of no renown. Yet they tell stories that inspired authors, founded new societies, mixed peoples and cultures, and were then forgotten. Marine archaeology is bringing these stories back to life.
Stay with us now and see how ocean currents link the sea and the atmosphere on the Atlantic realm. Then at 10, we have tonight's classic double feature. First, Fred and Ginger in The Gay Divorcee. Then Ginger Rogers and Katharine Hepburn in Stage Door. Check the listings. Check Channel 2. Good TV tonight.